In today's attention-driven world, businesses and brand owners are competing for our eyeballs and for our ears. But what if I told you there was a way you could boost your user base by 15% in a way that doesn't involve spending more on ads or cranking out 1,000 YouTube videos? That's why we're here today. We're talking with Dr. Nigel Newbutt. Dr. Nigel is an assistant professor of advanced learning technologies and director of the Emerging Technology Lab in the College of Education at the University of Florida. He is an award-winning, internationally recognized leader in the development of emerging technologies that advance access, inclusion, and meaningful participation for autistic and neurodivergent communities. Dr. Nigel explains that accessible design is just as much a business decision as it is an ethical one. Any business owner or product manager would never knowingly sign off on alienating or excluding 15% of your user base. But beyond reaching excluded market segments, accessible design benefits everyone in ways we can't always predict. For example, 13% of the population is hearing impaired, but 65% of people watch TV or YouTube with closed captions on. While view duration was not the goal of including captions, it is an unpredictable benefit that YouTube and broadcasters are definitely not mad about. Whether you're building for extended reality, mobile, or web, there is something to learn here from Dr. Nigel in this episode. And with that, let's get into the interview. So Nigel, again, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us today. And XR is a little bit niche. So can you tell us a bit about what first drew you to extended reality, augmented reality, and accessibility?
My interest in XR and accessibility really emerges or comes about through my long-standing commitment to understanding and meaningfully improving the experiences in my research of autistic and neurodiverse individuals. So within the context of education and their everyday lives, so we've worked within educational contexts, we've worked within transitions to work and employment contexts and independent living as well. And very early in my career, I saw and experienced how traditional learning environments and assessment approaches and employment pathways often failed to capture the strengths, preferences and potential of autistic groups and neurodiverse groups. So at the same time, I was witnessing, or we saw this rapid evolution of immersive technologies. And so my work kind of naturally maneuvered from virtual environments and screen-based technologies. And in 2015, when Oculus became commercially available, 2015, 2016, my work kind of naturally segued into asking questions around how this virtual reality and extended reality technology could actually impact positively the lives of autistic groups. And then also what drew me into this was the realization that XR could offer something really different actually to technologies that had gone before. This idea of controlled, customizable and low stakes environments to support autonomy, reduce anxiety and open up new pathways for skills development and inclusion really kind of cemented that I saw that this was a fantastic space to be researching. It had potential high impact. And at that time, we didn't know if extended reality or this new form of virtual reality technology would kind of have the legs. And we weren't sure if in 2016 it was going to bite, but here we are in 2025 and it's still here. So as researchers, we're asking questions around accessibility, ethics, where it can be best deployed, how it can be best used within learning, education, and like I say, workplace and other contexts for these particular groups.
One of the things that I love about XR, and your answer made me think of it, is because it's a medium. People bring their own life experiences, interests into the first time that they use XR, and then they make these really unique connections about the way the technology could be used. I don't know that it would be intuitive to a lot of people using VR for the first time. Oh, what a difference this could make for someone who's neurodivergent. Do you remember the first time you used like a VR headset?
So virtual reality and head-mounted displays have been around since the late 60s and through the 70s and 80s, very much used in sort of army base, military base, and sort of NASA based sort of context, obviously. But when I first experienced it in 2015 when we got the Oculus SDK1 and SDK2. So that was my first experience of it. And as you may remember, it was a bit glitchy. It was a bit buggy at the time. But when I put that headset on and there was a Tuscan village. It was one of their kind of pieces of software which kind of showcase what the technology could do. And it was a Tuscan village. And you could walk around this village and these properties and etc. And I think it was just seeing that for the first time and being in that space and thinking, oh my God, the ecological validity here, the sense of being somewhere else, this sense of presence is crazy powerful, really powerful. And then obviously it wasn't long before I was thinking, well, the work we've been doing over here with screen-based virtual reality or virtual environments, oh my God, how does that translate into this space in terms of providing highly immersive, highly realistic experiences that can be controlled, that can be predictable for this particular population? That's important. But then also experiencing something like that, how then could that generalization into the real world really be elevated and kind of moved in ways that we weren't able to do before? So it's really good that we had these screen-based platforms to teach, develop opportunity skills, but that transition into the real world wasn't necessarily very strong. But as soon as I experienced this technology, I thought, yeah, there's huge potential here. But equally, when I experienced that technology and had a bit of motion sickness and dizziness and eye strain, I thought there are also some safety and ethical questions that need to be approached here, which is what led us to do some of our first work in 2015 was to ask questions around how autistic people actually experience this new wearable technology, and wanted to really make sure that we understood their perspectives and then their voices were playing a central role in informing how these technologies could move forward.
Based on your research thus far, where are you seeing XR used the most effectively right now to close those accessibility gaps?
For different people, it sits in different spaces. But for me, I think I would summarize it as three key areas. We're seeing education and training being a space, healthcare and rehabilitation, vocational and physical rehabilitation, and also as an assistive technology. Within education and training, we're seeing extended reality being developed to help support individuals to practice skills. In some cases, technical procedures, which would be difficult to do in the real world, would be expensive to do in the real world. We're seeing it being used for softer skills like public speaking, giving people exposure to develop confidence in public speaking environments, even things like first aid and medical procedures. And all of those experiences are kind of in low risk environments, which is especially beneficial for those who might have differences, have anxiety or other learning disabilities. It makes the experience very experiential, but it also makes it quite accessible for a range of different people and can often speak to a lot of their strength and the ways that they learn. But also we see personalized learning coming into this, where it can be used to improve cognitive functioning, like attention for individuals with ADHD. So we see systems being developed that can very much promote, again, the way that people with ADHD experience the world. Within the healthcare space, pain management, VR is being used very much within sort of pain management contexts and physical and occupational therapy, where it can provide a useful and engaging tool for people to be able to develop social skills and social training for the populations I work with, for example, autistic groups. And we're also seeing it being used as an accessible tool to help provide access to healthcare. So virtual healthcare patient monitoring and gaining access to therapy using some of these technologies is another angle. And through the assistive technology lens, AR is being used to help provide heads-up displays for people with vision impairments, and systems have been developed to translate visual information into descriptive audio. So looking at the Meta glasses, for example, the Ray-Bans, that's a great example of providing audio information to people who may have issues in that space. It's being used in elderly populations as well, with a view of supporting patients with Alzheimer's. So this is kind of becoming quite pervasive across sort of education and health contexts.
What's really interesting here is that I think all three of us have had people come to us to ask to have XR close gaps across like very different industries. We worked on a NASA proposal to make astronaut training more accessible to more people, because we're sending more people than ever into space now. And historically, that self-selects for people with very good spatial intelligence. And now we're sending all kinds of people into space that maybe don't over-index on that as heavily. So we need training that's going to help level that playing field.
It's been quite interesting to see how pervasive it has become across these different sectors. And it's hard to think of many sectors that aren't deploying it or using it, even down to Walmart use it for customer service training. Starbucks use it, in a range of different customer service ways as well. It sits in a lot of places, and with a view in the business context, I guess, for other means. But I think, to your point, making sure that all those different users can access this technology is still a big question. That is still a big ask, and it's still something that is being addressed, designed with accessibility in mind right from the get-go. I think that's where we see the most successful examples, rather than seeing it as obviously as a bolt-on, which is the worst case scenario. And it's pleasing that many of the companies who are developing this stuff do see accessibility as important. But where people value accessibility and build it in from the get-go and make sure that they continue to iterate their technologies through that lens, we see really pleasing good examples. On the other hand, when we don't see that happening, we see those technologies often failing and not being successful. So I think accessibility isn't an optional thing. It's going to make your products better. That's really the business proposition, I think. And as a researcher, it's driven through the lens of the work I do. It's not optional for the work we do. It has to be accessible.
I think there's always a lot of cleaner headliner use cases to understand how XR can close accessibility gaps that are more physical in nature. So I think many of us have seen the videos circulating of like live translate for maybe someone who has a hearing impairment. When people think about XR being able to close accessibility gaps, the kind of immediate use cases people think about are usually augmented reality and physical disabilities. One of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you is because your research centers more on learning styles and neurodiversity. And I think those accessibility gaps are A, like less understood by the general population, and B, a little bit harder for people to connect the dots of how something like XR closes it.
I think you're right. Some of the use cases are, as you say, it's easier to see the connections, others not so. But I think extended reality or virtuality really does support diverse learning styles and neurodiversity better than 2D. Most obviously through the immersive nature of it, the multi-sensory nature of it, and the interactive experiences that can all together help transform passive observation into active participation, into experiential learning, which for those populations, those are often the markers that enable them to learn more effectively. We know that XR can also be highly customizable as well to meet sensory and cognitive needs. So while on the one hand, the multisensory thing might be a benefit, on the other hand, it might be a negative for some of those populations. So having the ability to customize or control some of these environmental factors can really tap into the strength of neurodiversity. Two particular cases that I've experienced or been involved with was in a school that we worked in the UK, a school for autistic individuals. They actually had a coffee shop built onto the school to enable transition into a work environment. There were challenges with transitioning into work, as transitions for autistic and neurodiverse groups can be very challenging. So the moments of transition into a job, for example, not knowing what to expect, not knowing how to interact with customers, not knowing how to operate some of the machinery, etc., etc. We implemented virtual reality as a way to help train the procedural knowledge and the procedural skills of making a coffee and making different types of coffee and what happens when things go wrong and how to navigate that. So providing an experience where they can make mistakes without real life consequences, they can do stuff at their own pace, they know that there's a predictable nature to what they're doing, but also it's a very highly realistic environment that replicates where they're going to be. And so in that example, we found a very successful use case of, by engaging a learning experience in that way, in that particular interface or medium, it enabled them to maneuver or transition into the coffee shop and have successful, meaningful experiences for them in that space. For people like this means that we can have very successful learning outcomes. It's just all because they don't learn in traditional ways that extend through Victorian models of education and that they don't operate in those spaces doesn't mean that they can't be successful if the learning materials presented in a different way.
That is such a good example because I could see for a specific individual, like maybe wanting to repeat a certain training many times. And then rather than having someone else helping you through it or being able to pause a specific training if they're needing a break in the moment and all of that kind of stuff, that's a level of control that you can and independence that you can empower the individual with that you really couldn't get in like a traditional coffee shop training where you're just training next to the barista.
In another example, we're working on an SF-funded project where we are trying to think about employment pathways for autistic undergraduate students into the semiconductor space. So Florida at the moment has a lot of industry moving into this space. There's a huge set of employment gaps. There's a huge talent gap, as we call it, within the semiconductor industry. We feel that autistic people in particular bring a lot of strengths to that particular area of work. But there is this kind of gap in terms of promoting and making sure they have the right skills. So in this project, we're actually building a bunch of educational materials that aren't just situated around traditional kind of online learning materials or video-based materials or just traditional educational experiences, but we're actually developing a VR experience which will actually provide them a hands-on, as close as they can get to a hands-on experience of being able to work through the process of quality assuring a microchip in this case. How do you quality assure that? What are the steps you need to engage with? How are you very accurate and very precise in what you do? Because that's very important. And one of the reasons for that is to make this industry more equitable So traditionally, in order to learn those skills, you have to go into a lab. These labs cost millions of dollars. When people make mistakes, which they do, it costs a lot of money. So again, what we tend to see is autistic people are excluded from some of those environments. And in fact, they don't even feel comfortable in those environments to perform at their best. So by recreating this in virtual reality, we're trying to explore whether or not that opens up certain barriers, makes this employment pathway more equitable, for that particular population. So that's another example of just how powerful and meaningful that modality of learning can be for that population.
And as you were talking, it made me think of these two demos they're both mixed reality demos and they're very polarizing, but it's a experience that detects people's faces and then will blur them out. You're only able to focus on one face at a time, or maybe no faces, depending on what you're doing. And then there was a second one that kind of does the opposite. It will identify faces and tell you what emotion and detects micro expressions and just puts like a box around their face and is like happy, sad. And people look at it and they're just like, why would you want that? And I looked at it and I was like, someone who is overwhelmed created this, or someone who does not easily pick up on micro expressions or just expressions in general. That's why they made this. And it's interesting because people see that and they're like, oh, Black Mirror is real. And I'm like, not exactly.
Because for some people, their brains are doing what that application was doing.
Yeah.
And for others, it's not.
It's not. Yeah. But I don't know if you've seen either of those two demos, but I'd love to hear your take on that as well.
No, I have. And my take is very similar to you. One thing to bear in mind, I'm sure we'll come to this as well later, what you're describing there, though, and this is what we often see, isn't it? When, and the kind of subtitling or closed captioning is a good example of it. Closed captioning is designed, obviously, for people who need it, people who can't hear. But actually, Netflix reports that 68% of people use closed captioning or subtitles. So when you make something out of that need, so to your point with those two use cases you mentioned, I can imagine those would be beneficial to a lot of people, whether they're autistic or neurodiverse or not, or whether they have problems focusing or have ADHD. I could imagine benefits for those for a lot of people. And I think that's what we often see when you design for differences. We often see that is promoted across a whole range of different people. And I mean, we're also talking about, just to be clear, more than 50 million people in America are have a form of disability. So this isn't a small niche that we're designing for. This isn't a small kind of population. It represents almost 15% of America. And that's only for people who have a registered continuous disability. People develop disabilities throughout their lifetime as well. So that, if that number's large, autistic people, 1 in 31, neurodiverse people, 1 in 5. As we get better with diagnosing and better understanding these issues, then we're going to see that growth increase, and we're going to need to adapt and to change. I'd like to think we're going to need to adapt and change environments, but until we do that, we're going to need to use technologies as a way to bridge and to make sure people feel empowered and comfortable and able to operate in those environments. And I love the two cases you just mentioned, that both of those cases would enable somebody to feel more empowered and able to cope in that environment and to navigate that environment. And that then just gets the best out of them. And if you're in a work environment, don't you want to get the best out of somebody who's very good at doing something? That's a great example of how we can empower, support, and get the best out of people. And on the backdrop of all those numbers I just mentioned, despite 1 in 31 people in America being diagnosed autistic, or youth being diagnosed autistic, 83% of autistic people are under or unemployed. There's a societal issue here at play as well. Autistic people express wanting to work, they express wanting to have an independent life, a successful, fruitful life. There's so many barriers, and these technologies can just mow those barriers down and help maneuver through them.
Who doesn't want to be a part of a society where every person has access to skills that they need to be the best version of themselves and contribute? And then putting on my technologist, entrepreneur, business hat, right? If I don't design for accessibility, you're telling me that 15% of my total addressable market, 15% of my potential user base is now inaccessible to me as a business owner, right? I don't want that. I'm not going to make a decision as a product person that's going to cut off 15% of my potential user base, of my potential source of revenue for whatever I'm selling to those users. So I think there's so many aspects by which this, to your point, becomes not a niche conversation, even though it feels like one. I am curious to hear your thoughts about how XR does actually also introduce some new accessibility concerns by its nature as a medium or as a modality.
So there are challenges such as sensory overstimulation, cyber sickness, and differences with physical and motor controls required by controllers and body movement within these spaces. And newer challenges also include hardware and software capability issues, a lack of standardized accessibility design. We see a lot of younger autistic groups and just frankly younger people having some issues with the fine motor controls. And even moving in some of these spaces, sometimes you need to teleport inside a virtual environment to move from area A to area B, or around a room. Sometimes you can physically walk, but then in the real world you might bump into something. So that presents accessibility issues for people that can't do some of those things. But we have seen some of these technology developers or things like Meta and Apple remove some of those issues. So the need for physical hand controllers has been removed in some more recent versions of the software. So you can actually use your real hands. But then what if you don't have hands, or if your hands are not manipulated in ways that typically we can manipulate them? While we overcome one set of problems, we then approach another set of problems potentially.
Just to double down on what you were saying earlier about developing for accessibility often benefits across the user group. A couple of examples came to mind, and one of them I think illustrates just how broad. So you're talking about teleporting. The amount of meetings I've had in my life about teleportation is a little bit like absurd at this point, but it's one of the things we have to talk about a lot. And that ability to remove the necessity for someone in a virtual space to have to physically walk somewhere, that might sound niche. I got to use the virtual reality system that they use to train astronauts to walk on the moon, on the lunar surface, when I was at NASA. One of the coolest days in my life, don't get me wrong. And they had to develop a teleportation feature for astronauts. So like someone who is as physically fit as you could possibly be, because we're going to launch you into space and send you to the moon. Like you're going to be in probably tip-top physical form, right? Even that person needed a teleportation feature in the application because it took forever to walk around on the moon and it just was not practical. So that was an example that came to mind when you were like, some people need this. And it's not just people that have mobility issues. It's something that applies in many different use cases.
It sounds amazing. I can only imagine what that looked and felt like. I mean, that must have been almost an out-of-body experience, I'm sure, experiencing that. It's also worth thinking about who's designing these technologies, and are we including the perspectives of some of these populations early on? And so, for example, are these software and hardware experiences being designed and developed through a neurotypical lens? Is the thought here? Is the challenge here? So how do we overcome that? Obviously we have diverse teams of people designing this that represent all of these different facets of society. So having a diverse team to inform those challenges is important. But I think it's also worth mentioning, and I think maybe you were leaning into this with the teleporting option as well, is that the hardware itself can be limited. I mean, one of the most obvious problems, but it's a problem every time I work with a group, is somebody wearing glasses and wearing a headset. You can literally see it in real time happening. You can see they're wearing glasses. This headset's not going to, that's an obvious thing. And even the fact that some of these headsets have been historically, maybe not so much now, are quite heavy. We've worked with younger groups, we've worked with people with very sensitive sort of contextual stuff going on. And that's a challenge just to get them to wear the technology to start with. So making sure that the experiences we're creating can also be experienced on a 2D screen is important. For example, having different ways of accessing these experiences can be potentially important as well.
We're working on a project right now that will be a brand experience, primarily designed for a brand to connect with potential users at conferences and other professional environments like that, as well as a VR version of the experience, which is the main thing that we are providing. We're providing what we are calling an accessibility build. We wanted to make sure that someone didn't have a bad experience with this brand because they approached them at a booth at a conference and then couldn't experience what they had to offer at that booth. We have a version that we are going to be able to run on desktop, and we have a couple of different control mechanisms. So the individual who maybe wears glasses or maybe is more sensitive to sensory overload can interact with it through the desktop, where they have more volume control, where they're a little bit more removed from the experience, and where they don't have to take their glasses off or don't have to put something over their glasses. And we don't want to cut off the potentially 15% of people that will come up to your booth and want to interact with your brand and want to have a positive experience with you and learn about what you're offering, but not be able to jump into a VR experience.
Yeah, I love that, having the other way of interacting and interfacing, not further disabling that person or othering that person, is really important. To your point, in terms of what design considerations can developers keep in mind, I mean, my kind of headline for that is always, You just need to make sure you start from the principle that accessibility isn't a feature you add on, but a foundation that you build in, that you center the design from, and that you don't start figuring stuff out later that's going to cause problems. The product's never going to be as good, the service will never be as good. And I think in VR, this can begin with, in terms of things you need to think about, comfort and control is really important. So developers should provide multiple locomotion options, adjustable movement speeds, clear visual anchors, and ways to reduce motion sickness as an absolute minimum. And they need to do this as they're building out their experiences. So this isn't just a hardware issue necessarily. This is, software developers as well needing to understand those issues. And you do that through user testing. You do it through user testing with a range of different populations. Ideally, having those people in your design team would certainly help. Interfaces should be as simple as possible, consistent, readable, with alternatives to gesture-only controls such as voice commands. I haven't seen voice commands particularly well utilized, maybe as they could be. Controller shortcuts or gaze-based interaction. We see gaze-based interactions in newer technology, so I hope that's going to be something that that moves quickly. And for augmented reality as another form of XR, considerations obviously then expand into the real world, and developers need to be really mindful of things like contrast, lighting, visual clutter, because the user is layering digital information onto this physical space, which is also dynamic. Simple things, I guess, like making sure text is legible in varied environments. We've just completed an augmented reality experience it's called the New Worlds Reading Initiative here in the state of Florida. And we've just created some augmented reality experiences to help engage young children in reading. But something we've been very clear on in doing that is we have done lots of user testing as we went through the process to make sure text was readable, it was understandable. We made sure it was available in 3 different languages. Here in Florida, Haitian Creole is a popular language. Spanish, Portuguese are popular languages. A lot of families speak those. So making sure that it's interchangeable with language is a very simple accessibility thing.
An interesting anecdote from us that I think you'll find entertaining. So we were testing a really early version of Katana XR on an Air Force base, and we were actually inside of a large jet. And for anyone who has not been inside the cockpit of a large jet, it is all windows. And we were not in a hangar, we were on a tarmac, and it was an incredibly bright day. And I go to launch the application and I could not read a thing. Even though we had tested it in what we thought were plenty of lighting environments, still the majority of them had been indoor. So 100% outside lighting was just something we hadn't tested for, and we could not read it to save ourselves. Laura, I don't know if you remember, you ended up having to stand in front of me to create enough of a light blockage that I could actually run the test that we had to do. Luckily for us, this was really early on in the development cycle, so it was easy to change. And we ended up making it a user-powered switch. The whole application could be turned into light mode, and the whole application could be flipped into dark mode, which is something that we're familiar with on the web, but was something that we missed in the first design cycle. Developers should help other developers. We actually did spin that out as a free Unity asset. So we'll link it in the notes below, but if anyone wants to go add that to their Unity application, they can just take our work. We did it so no one else should have to make that mistake. Also, we did it so that we could use it across all of our projects.
Yes, we went all the way to an Air Force base in Wichita, so you don't have to.
This has been such a great conversation. We really appreciate you coming in. How can listeners reach you or follow more of your work or learn more about the research that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation. People can reach me on LinkedIn. My name, Nigel Newbutt. There's only one of me in the world, to the best of my knowledge. And my research lab is linked on LinkedIn as well. So that would be the best way for people to find out more about the work I'm doing.
Amazing. And yeah, we can leave some links in the description or in the show notes just to make it easy for people who want to connect. And thank you again for coming on to the show. I really enjoyed this conversation as well. We hope to have you back soon. And if you enjoyed this episode and you're out there listening, make sure you check out this one next, and we'll see you next time. Bye.